Good evening, and thank you for watching another episode of Chad Jackson Live. I'm joined this evening with Dr. Mary Graybar. How are you, Ms. Graybar? Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Can you hear me, Dr. Graybar?
Oh, yeah. Hey.
Okay.
Hello.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Dr. Graybar is a former professor at Emory, and is now writing for the Alexander Hamilton Institute?
Yes, I'm a resident fellow here at the Alexander Hamilton Institute for the study of Western civilization.
Nice. I've quickly become a fan of yours, Dr. Graybar, so thank you so much for joining me this evening. You wrote an article. So you wrote an article this what was that, a week ago or so, called "The Never-Ending 1619 Riots." And what I particularly liked about this article is how you give a history of riots dating as far back as the 1930s, and then from then to today. Why was it important to give that history?
Well, because I think we're seeing a lot of commentary on what has been happening since 2020, as if this was a new phenomenon, and it's important to understand the genesis of rioting, that it was a strategy or a tactic that was deliberately used in the 1930s by the communists. And it was used, during the hunger marches of the Depression, during the Scottsboro trials, and then it was picked up again in the 1960s. And, for several years, we had a series of riots, waves of riots going from coast to coast. And then we sort of have, periods of quiescence. There's always the threat there. And then, in 2020, the activist Black Lives Matter turned back to a tried and true method. And so, it's an old strategy. It's used because people find that it's effective. They get what they want. They get the money, and they get legislation. And it's a way to sort of control the political process.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's important to understand that. And of course, Black Lives Matter is a Marxist organization. No surprise that they would, encourage racial division and hostility and seek to exploit that, make money off of it. The more violence for them, the better it is, because they get more money. And it's the same thinking and the same strategy that has been used for, about 100 years in this country.
So how did the communists figure out this as a successful tactic, getting the people into the streets, using hyper-emotionalism and sensationalism, and propaganda to evoke people to get violent. How did the communists figure out that this is a practical means by which to get what they want in a respective country?
Well, they didn't have that much success in the 1930s. It was then being used as a strategy for recruitment and to raise money. So I briefly mentioned the Scottsboro case, which was the case of nine young black men and some. The youngest one, I think, was 13. They ranged in age from 13 to 20. They were traveling on the railroads, on the in the boxcars, and two young white women who thought they were going to get in trouble for things that they'd done accused them of rape. And after 4 days of trials for all of them, one case was dismissed. They were sentenced to the electric chair. And the communists jumped in, not wanting to help them, but to exploit the situation. And there were worldwide protests and riots around this. It was to show that the United States in a bad light, to recruit members, and to raise money. And they had raised like $250,000, which was a large amount back then.
Yeah.
But very, very little of that went to the defense of the Scottsboro boys who lingered on in jail. The last one was not released until 1950, so this was 1931. And they did that. They knew the longer they were in jail, the more money they could raise. So we've got the same thing in 2020. Look at millions of dollars that was raised by Black Lives Matter.
Mm.
And that wasn't used for the Black community or for people who were unjustly accused of crimes. It was used to enrich a few people at the top.
Yeah. I remember, listening to Manning Johnson, who was a communist who defected from the Communist Party. And he had mentioned in what is called the Manning Johnson farewell address that the NAACP and organizations like them go out of their way to create race issues. And so, looking into it myself, he's absolutely right. They either went out of their way to, and not just the NAACP, but other such, front groups and organizations. Not only did they go out of their way to create race issues, they harped on and really exacerbated issues that had, you know, um, um, racial elements to it, so as to further their own cause. So, that was interesting to see. You mentioned George Schuyler in the beginning of your piece, namely referencing the fact that the communists were behind a lot of these agitative efforts. Talk a little bit about him. Who is George Schuyler, and why is he important?
Yes, George Schuyler was the most discussed Black journalist in all of Harlem, according to Melvin Tolson, who was writing for the American Mercury in 1933. Schuyler was born in 1895, was raised in Syracuse, New York, spent about 7 years in the Army, and became the most widely read Black journalist in America in the late 1920s and 30s. He first worked for the socialist magazine, The Messenger, and then in 1924, a year later, also started writing for the Pittsburgh Courier, which he helped make the largest circulation Black newspaper in the country. He was extremely popular, very provocative. He was often called the Black H.L. Mencken. Um, and so he was, in his heyday in the 30s and 40s when he still had socialist views. He was a socialist. He was an anti-communist socialist. Um, but then after he experienced the New Deal, he became a conservative and then was a persona non grata, expelled from, the Black community, the people who had once been his allies. opposed him, and he was basically canceled, especially after Martin Luther King Jr. came on the scene in the 1950s. Um, and Schuyler was a constitutionalist. He was a states' rights advocate for civil rights, was alarmed by what he saw in the 1930s and the 1940s by the rise of totalitarianism, and was concerned that the same thing would happen to this country. So he began to value the Constitution and the separation of powers and local and state governments, as a bulwark against that. And, he also joined the John Birch Society in the 60s, started writing for them, and has basically been memory holed by historians, because of his conservative views. But he was very prescient. The things that I see that are occurring in this country, he was writing about, you know, way back. He died in 1977.
Mm-hmm.
And so because he was someone who was warning about what was happening to this country, and was hated by the communists and by people on the left, communist sympathizers as well. He has been besmirched when he is discussed, but otherwise he's been forgotten.
Yeah. You mentioned the word anti-communist. Um, I've noticed, when doing my research, and I'm not saying this is true of George Schuyler, it's obviously not, but for a lot of people who did refer to themselves as anti-communist, they were in fact communist. Was this a tactic that they would use, the communists?
I didn't hear all that. If they were anti-communists,
No, no, no.
they
So my question was, and I'm not saying this is true of George Schuyler because it's obviously not, but I've noticed in doing my own research that there were many who referred to themselves as anti-communists, and these were individuals who were in fact communist. Was this a tactic that people would use as a kind of subversive tactic to say, "Oh, I'm actually an anti-communist," all the while they're a fellow traveler or a sympathizer to communist efforts?
Oh, yeah, people would deny that they were communists or fellow travelers. A lot of them got swept up into these front groups, the front groups that Schuyler was exposing week after week in his weekly columns, and saying, "Look, don't get involved with the National Negro Congress or all these other groups that sounded like civil rights groups." But a lot of people, you know, who may not have been officially Communist Party members. They didn't have a card, that certified them as members of the Communist Party, were sympathizers and were working for the communist cause. And so, deviousness and lying is part of the communist strategies. So, yeah, people, especially if they wanted to recruit others, did not let on that they, in fact, were working for the communist cause.
Yeah.
And Schuyler knew that. He knew he knew the people, a lot of the people personally, and so he would try to warn his readers. A lot of people were naive, or they just, went along with it and, wanted a new communist order.
Hmm. Um, what did George Schuyler make of a young Martin Luther King stepping onto the scene? Like, what was his take on Martin Luther King and the popularization of King?
Yeah, well, at first he was cautiously optimistic, because it seemed like King was for Black advancement and self help. And then he shifted, and Schuyler did not like the Gandhian techniques. He was a critic of Gandhi, the passive resistance, the nonviolent approach, because usually, as happened with Gandhi, even though you're saying nonviolence, violence follows, and it happens often when there are large crowds. And Schuyler did not like that also because he felt that it was degrading. It was like waving an empty pistol, as he said. You would rile up people, you wouldn't get things done, you would stir animosity between the races, and you'd actually, you know, alienate the people who were in power that you wanted to change their minds and to change the laws. And that was King's strategy. He started taking up protests and marches, and Schuyler felt that that was counterproductive, and that was the strategy of the communists. And he'd seen it all before. He'd seen it in the 1930s. So this was nothing new to him.
Oh wow. Yeah, it's that always struck me as um uh, odd that a lot of journalists were so infatuated and so impressed with Martin Luther King, and very rarely did you see anyone, at least in the mainstream, speaking out against some of the things that King was doing. And even to this very day, you have a lot of people, both left and right, who still tries to lay claim to Martin Luther King's legacy, even though the verdict is in terms of where his loyalties were, in terms of his partiality to Marxism, his proclivity to Marxism. And why do you believe that a lot of scholars, specifically those who consider themselves conservative, why do you think that they don't really acknowledge Martin Luther King's Marxism?
They're afraid to. I don't know if you remember what happened to Rand Paul in 2010. He made a comment about the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and he was basically saying what Barry Goldwater said was that there were a couple parts of it that made things worse. And this is a thing that Schuyler foresaw, that there would be this huge bureaucracy, and there'd be quotas, and we'd have affirmative action, and we're seeing this. So a lot of conservatives have just been frightened. They like to latch on to the "I have a dream" speech, which, as you pointed out in one of your blog pieces, was not even written by King, and it doesn't comport with the bulk of his writing, which was definitely advancing redistribution, sort of socialistic goals. And a lot of the radicals, take up King for those writings, and the words are there. They are for redistribution, but I think a lot of conservatives just want. They do believe in civil rights. Of course, I do too. So they are afraid that if they criticize King, they will be accused of being anti-civil rights. And so the issue has been confused. I mean, King has become the standard bearer of civil rights. He is the symbol, and all those other people have been forgotten. Booker T. Washington's forgotten, George Schuyler's forgotten, James Weldon Johnson is forgotten. You had all these, great leaders who were, advancing civil rights, but they've all been overshadowed by King. And so it's very easy also for conservatives to say, yes, King, look at what he said in this part of the "I Have a Dream" speech. We're all for that, to be judged on the content of our character, not on the color of our skin. I think there are several reasons why, he is sort of held up and, just praised without any kind of, close attention to what he really did say.
Yeah, it just strikes me as odd once again because, conservatives are the faction that lauds themselves as being smarter than their political adversaries, and they're always saying that liberals are brainwashed and gullible and this, that, and the third. And to me, Martin Luther King and his version of civil rights was was the biggest subversive tactic, I think, in American history, because here you have a man who postured himself as patriotic, as a Christian pastor, and as it turns out, he didn't even believe in the resurrection of Jesus, which is a pretty big deal for someone who claims that they're a Christian.
Yeah.
He once again favored Marxist ideas. And,
Mm-hmm.
The fact is, when you find out that he didn't write a lot of his speeches, and when you find out the fact, just his whole kind of time here on this earth, and a lot of the things that he was up to, and the things that he believed, even though that is verifiably true, a lot of conservatives, at least in the public eye, not only do they turn a blind eye to these verifiable facts, they embrace Martin Luther King as this hero. And for me, just speaking completely for myself, I think that that's actually counterproductive. If it is our goal as conservatives to get back to the idea of a constitutional republic, of a true meritocracy, we're not going to do that by clinging to these mythological heroes that didn't further our cause, but rather was a kind of Trojan horse to our cause, which helped to usher in a sense, the widening of the federal government's powers.
Mm-hmm.
I, for one, am not a fan of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. What is your take on the Civil Rights Act of 1964?
Well, when I was teaching before I was canceled, I sometimes would teach Barry Goldwater's speech, on the Senate floor against the Civil Rights Act, and he predicted, that it would, bring about this huge bureaucracy, and it has, and we no longer have a meritocracy. We now have a system where spoils are divided by your victim status. And also, the Civil Rights Act ushered in this idea that there are victim groups. Notice how many other groups have piggybacked onto this idea that you have to give special privileges to someone because they've been oppressed or discriminated against. You had women. So now if you have a business, it has to be woman owned. It's usually the wife of a man or something. Gay rights, Latinos, Asian Americans, and they have all these acronyms. You just can't keep up with it. So, and here we've got, medical schools where, future doctors have to repeat this oath about diversity, and it's not limited to one group. It's a new way of sort of conducting our government, and it has helped usher in socialism. Where willy nilly, things like students are seen as oppressed. Oh, forgive their, student loan debts. And so it has just taken over. Christopher Caldwell wrote a book a couple years ago about this phenomenon, how this has exploded, although I think he's a little too afraid to pin it on the Civil Rights Act because, he's worried he'll be branded as a racist if he does. I mean, that's what happens. If you criticize the Civil Rights Act or Martin Luther King at all. You are just branded. And I think conservatives have to get away from that fear because, it's a Saul Alinsky like tactic where, you have to isolate the opponent and, brand him and call him names.
Hmm. I think it's interesting that a lot of conservatives, for fear of not being accused of being conspiracy theorists, um, choose not to look into a lot of these things that you and I are talking about, and choose to kind of take the face value narrative of what is being disseminated throughout the ether of society, whether it be through secondary, primary education, and uh, higher education. But whenever you look at the fact that a lot of these Marxists and leftists, or whatever you want to call them, have invested so much of their time in the social sciences, it makes one wonder, like, okay, what do these people plan on doing with all of this knowledge of studying human behavior, the inclinations of how people move and operate as a group and as a collective versus how they move as individuals? And then you see you see them kind of building policy as a result of the things that they're learning. How could you not think that all of this is meant, for human conditioning, with Marxism or globalism in mind? Do with that what you want. Or yeah.
Yeah, no, I saw that, when I was teaching, and I'm not surprised by what is happening. When I saw, these groups of rioters in 2020, interracial groups, often you had more young white people rioting. Of course, they went into black neighborhoods and destroyed them and then went home to their own neighborhoods. But from what I know, I wrote a lot about education. I was in the middle of it. I was given the textbooks to use. I went to conferences. I kept up with the policies K through 12. It's no surprise that you've got these, insane mobs that are, jumping on statues and trying to tear them down. They're crazy with rage, and it's because they've been indoctrinated from a very young age. They don't know any better. They've been emotionally abused in schools. So, when what they call social and emotional learning is really social and emotional abuse. And so it's no surprise to me 20 years later to see the outcome of what we have.
Mhm.
And the demand is for a new Marxist form of government. That's what they want. That's what they've been educated in. It's been called other things, but it's essentially Marxism. And, when I was in graduate school in the 1990s, in the English department, and reading these postmodernist theorists, Foucault and Lacan and Kristeva, they have their own vocabulary, and the writing is turgid and dense, and it's difficult to understand. But when you analyze it and you break it down, you see it's all essentially Marxist.
Mhm.
And there's a trickle down effect from graduate schools to high schools and down to elementary schools. And now we're seeing it 30 years later in elementary schools with critical race theory. I mean, critical race theory is something that wasn't, it was called that when I was in graduate school and my first years of teaching. um, but it was in the colleges. It wasn't in, K through 12. Now it is. But that's their plan. They start off small and specialized, and they work their way through the system. And, it's taken years and years, but here we are.
Yeah, I've always believed that social emotional learning, will yield a generation of young radical activists, just because it's teaching you how to think about oppression and how to think about, your oppressed kind of position in society, and how the system is stacked against you, and how, collectively we can come together and overthrow some of these things that ail society and keep people oppressed. And so it's interesting to see that SEL is being delivered to or taught to educators as a good thing. And a lot of educators genuinely believe that it's a good thing. They genuinely believe that this is something that can help me be a better educator. It can help my children, or my students rather. It can help me kind of cope with my students and some of the things that they struggle with. While all the while, those who are the kind of generators and concoctors of SEL know full well what they're doing and what the intended purpose of it is and what the outcome of it will be. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think there is a lot of kids that are coming to school do have social and emotional problems. They're coming from dysfunctional families, broken families. I have a friend who's just retiring from teaching elementary school. These kids come into her class smelling like marijuana because their parents are smoking it in the car as they drive them to school. I mean, there is a need, but the social and emotional learning is people. It's intended. The name is intended to fake people out. Okay, it sounds like a good thing. Okay, you want to give these kids who are lacking something at home nurturing. You want to help them along. It sounds good. But what social and emotional learning does is it predisposes people to abandon logic. And again, this is something that has trickled down. So back when I was in graduate school in the 90s, and I'm reading these theories about, feminist theory and postmodernist theory about how logic and reason are really tools of the patriarchy to oppress women and other, non-white heterosexual males, and that we should think more emotionally like women and minorities supposedly do. I was seeing this as an attack on Western civilization, all that we've achieved. And of course, so social and emotional learning also encourages children at a young age to abandon objectivity and logic, things that schools should be teaching them, and to instead rely on their emotions. And when you have people just going according to their emotions, you cannot have a functioning society or the kind of government and civilization that we have.
Yeah, and I think that a good case study of kind of what you're talking about was the general public's kind of overall reaction to COVID, and a lot of the regulations and mandates that were being passed down from the federal government and then from the respective state governments, and how ready and willing so many people were to be compliant to those rules and regulations out of fear. And my mind, of course, began to wander and think, like, how did we get to this place in Western civilization where we're so willing and ready to obey something that clearly, it's not definitive in terms, it wasn't definitive at the time in terms of, wearing a mask everywhere you go is going to help, fend off, the virus and all these different things that we were being told. You had a division in the medical community based upon the facts that we were being told in the media, and rather than looking at that information objectively and presenting kind of both sides of the argument with the objective to say, look, we just want the people to be responsible, whether you choose to wear a mask, whether you choose not to, whether you choose to get vaccinated, whether you choose not to. We just trust that you as the American people will move responsibly regardless of what decision you make. Instead of going about it that way, the media kind of planted its stake on the more progressive, quote unquote, side of the medical field and the science field, so on and so forth. And then they used very threatening and very, taboo language against those who either doubted the effectiveness of 24/7 mask wearing or the effectiveness of the vaccine and all these different things. And of course, I don't want to drag you into a conversation about the vaccine, but my point is, like, the media demonstrated that they were more interested in telling people how to live their lives than they were in presenting the facts, regardless of where those facts are coming from, presenting the facts and trusting that people will make their own decision. And rather than the average American citizen seeing this, and there were a lot of people that did, to be fair, but for a lot of people, rather than seeing this and resolving to make their own decision regardless of what the media says, many people were just being compliant to what the media were saying. And I think that has something to do with education, or the way in which we are educated in our school system, not to be critical thinkers, not to be people who takes the, what we're hearing through a kind of mental refinery, but rather just yesing, amening, and complying with anything that we hear, so long as it's coming from something that has a perception of being credible. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think you're right. We have been conditioned to, rely on our emotions, and fear is a tool that, dictatorships use. Going back to Schuyler and his conversion to conservatism, you had Franklin Roosevelt, who exploited the fear that people had during the Great Depression, when he said, you have nothing to fear but fear itself. Um, well, I would say, what the people had to fear was Roosevelt and
Right.
and the growing government. So it's a way to control people. And Franklin Roosevelt was an incredibly controlling person. Schuyler, along with thousands and thousands of other Americans, referred to him as a dictator. And Franklin Roosevelt would never have been able to do what he did had it not been for the fact that people were afraid. They were, literally going hungry. And during COVID, people didn't know what to do. Here you have this virus. You're not a doctor. And so they complied. And, when the people in power saw, well, that there were some dissidents, people who didn't want to do what we were being told. I mean, I talked about, going to my local grocery store. They had arrows down the aisles, where you had
Wow.
to walk one way. I don't know if that happened, in Texas.
It did.
Well, our governor is Kathy Hochul. You have to remember that, right?
Yeah.
She's very power hungry. I mean, she was going to put people in concentration camps.
Hmm.
There was a lawsuit against her. It's being appealed, but they were going to start setting those up. But I remember, it just became more and more ridiculous. You had to wear a mask. You had to stand 6 feet apart, and then they had these arrows, where you go down the grocery store. And as an act of rebellion, I went the opposite way.
Doing your part.
Like, stop me, you stock boy. What are you going to do?
I wanted to
Under
ask.
citizens arrest.
I wanted to
I
ask you,
forgot to
because
get
you
it
had
out.
mentioned earlier, before we went live, you had mentioned earlier that you were teaching, and then you got canceled, as many professors do who resolve to speak the truth. Um, this whole idea of being canceled is very interesting to me because it presupposes that there is a set of values um, that one has to defy, and to the extent that one defies those values, their cancellation ensues. What do you think are the values, whether named or unnamed, that exist in modern Western culture uh, that we are all, in a sense, kind of bound by, and to the extent that we are in a position of status, whether it be a professor, a celebrity, a politician, or whomever, like what are those values um, that guide everyone and polices everyone, in your opinion?
Well, it's the value of conformity by, uh, to whoever's at the top. Those values constantly change. Now, I was, I just posted on my website, Dissident Prof, a review of a book by Stanley Ridgely, Brutal Minds. And, a colleague of mine that I have met, lives in Wisconsin, wrote this review. And back in 2013, I had self-published this book called Exiled, and we didn't have a term for it. We didn't know that we had been canceled, but it was a collection of several essays by people like me who were being kicked out of their adjunct positions or people threatened. And one thing, when you're saying, well, what are the standards? You have to recognize that as in the Soviet Union, remember the purges, Stalin killed all those people in 36, 37, all the old Bolsheviks that had stuck by him, risked their lives, they all of a sudden were canceled, and they were literally canceled by being lined up against the wall and shot.
Wow.
Well, these people weren't keeping up. And so I'd sent, Professor Allen an email and saying, remember the good old days when there used to be on every campus during Valentine's Day and Women's History Month, the vagina monologues. Well, that was 10 years ago. Now you can't do that because it excludes transgenders.
Wow.
so, so if you were a feminist back in 2013 and saying, yeah, we're going to put on this play, we're going to make, classes come to it and write papers on it. Well, today, you would be denounced as transphobic.
Wow.
Because you'd say only women have that part of the anatomy. So you constantly have to keep up with it. And that's exactly what was happening in the Soviet Union. All these people who had been, dedicated to the cause, found themselves, sent to the gulags where they died. That actually happened to the first black communist, Lovett Fort Whiteman, who, was one of the first ones to go to Russia in 23, I think it was, and was rah-rah and, enthused, moved back to Russia, wanted to come back here to America, but was there and was a true believer, but he didn't keep up with the switches in the doctrine, and he died in the Gulag in 1939. So, when it comes to, avoiding being canceled, you always have to be on your toes. You always have to know what the new rules are, and so you have to be ready to switch. Otherwise, you're going to be canceled. Or worse, I mean, right now, people are losing their jobs, but it's getting down to health care. We're going to be denied medical treatment. you know, who knows? I mean, the goal of the real radicals is to put conservatives into concentration camps.
Yeah, yeah, and that's funny that you mentioned that, because I mean I would venture to say, and you could probably speak to this better than I can, um, that a lot of college campuses are crawling with students who were bitten by the Marxist bug and who have all kinds of ideas about the kind of government that they think is virtuous and moral and all the things, and that
Mm-hmm.
that government, their idea or their vision of a government or of a utopia or nirvana, uh, doesn't have people like myself and you in it, because we wouldn't be long for this world had they, if they were to have their way. And we see this, throughout history with people coming to power like Fidel Castro and others who, once they got their way, once they got into positions of power, their political adversaries were uh, expired from this world, so to speak. You had mentioned feminism. By my estimation, second wave feminism was a shock to Western society. Um, Whether you're talking about their propaganda and the way that they were able to lambast and besmirch traditional womanhood, at the same time that you have a lot of this rhetoric and propaganda going on, you have the decision of Roe v. Wade in 1973, which, for all intents and purposes, kind of put women on an equal footing with men in the workforce, in that if a woman gets pregnant, she's not sidelined by that pregnancy. She can terminate the pregnancy and still keep her job year round. Whereas before that time, if you got pregnant, you would have to, take a leave. You have, at the same time this is going on, an entire kind of Western infrastructure being built around the modern woman. Um, Talk a little bit about, what your own uh, kind of take was on the height of feminism, in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah, well, I was lured into that for a while, and and then it suddenly, dawned on me that really feminism was a way for men to exploit women.
Hmm.
Um, Roe v. Wade absolved men of the responsibility of fatherhood. It gave them freedom, the sexual revolution. It was all sort of geared towards the benefit of men, not really women. And we see the logical outcome today when you've got men who are insisting on competing in women's sports. I mean, there's no more stark example of the physical differences between men and women, and how, if you don't acknowledge those differences, it harms women. So it, goes back to reproduction. You have to recognize those differences, and make allowances, and have a society where children are raised with two parents, and a father who's supportive. Um, so you have to acknowledge those differences. Roe v. Wade, I think, uh, acted as if men and women, like you said, were completely equal. Take away that biological difference, the pregnancies, so that men and women are on an equal footing in the workplace. But when you do that and you're ignoring the reality of the differences, it puts women at a disadvantage. The same thing is being done now with women's sports, with these men coming in, and you know, and you can't deny that difference and advantage. And so it's harming women. I mean, it's just think about these men now. They want, you know, they want to, have it all, be number one on the women's swim team, not be burdened with the responsibility of a child. So if you couldn't think of a better scheme, to disadvantage women, I think. And so the feminist movement, beyond, the idea that, women should, have equal access to jobs and not be discriminated against, and, when it comes to banking and so forth, I think it's a plot against women.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so too. I mean, it's interesting because, I do believe that as Americans, we live in the freest country in the world. But that freedom, I mean, there's only so much you can do with your freedom. And to the extent that you utilize a freedom to do a thing, you are necessarily sacrificing another thing. And so if modern feminism tells you that you can be this and you can be that and you don't need this and you don't need that, I mean, you're only one person in this world with the same, number of hours in a day, the same number of days in a year. So there's only so much more, there's only so much of you that you can give, whether it be as a wife or as a mother or as a career woman or as a this or as a that. And the same thing is true of men. And so if you are going to pursue all these things, you're necessarily have to do it at the expense of something, because you can't really juggle all of that, unless you're some kind of superhuman. But again, last I checked, we all have the same hours in the day. We all have the same days in a week and weeks in a year. And so for me, even as a man who owns a business and has a wife and has kids, my kids only get to see so much of me because I work so much during the day. And I try to make the most of the time that I'm with them. But, I have to put kind of limitations on what I'm doing in a given day so as to make sure that I'm raising up my children correctly. To the extent that both my time and my wife's time is limited with our kids, those kids have to necessarily be brought up, raised, educated by someone or something. And so what we've done is we've created an entire culture where children are spending less and less time with mom and dad, because it used to be the case where at least mom was at home and I had that kind of connection and I was being brought up under those values and so on and so forth. To the extent that the kids or the state gets access to the kids at an earlier and earlier and earlier age as time moves on, how do we as a society not think that our children will become statists or just become completely antithetical to the values and the culture that we're trying to instill in them? And so I think for a lot of people, because they don't think in those terms, they still want to kind of cling to what they perceive to be the glory of modern Western culture, this kind of frivolous and, pro-indulgence culture. They want to kind of maintain some kind of grasp on that, while at the same time wanting to kind of uphold some kind of traditional values. But what we're seeing time and again is that you have to let go of one to cling to the other. You can't have both. I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense, but what's your take on that?
Oh yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I think that was one of the big lies of, the feminist movement. And it used to be our institutions supported families. Now, uh, I went to grammar school in the '60s, and you would never hear of a teacher, telling students, you need to defy your parents. I mean, it was understood that public school teachers were paid for by the taxpayers, and they were not surrogate parents in the classroom. And I think that has happened. But again, I think because of the sort of drift of our society, away from, the family, that has happened. So, we're getting away from that, and we see that in our government. I was at a Moms for Liberty meeting, and the thing that they're bringing up are community schools, and this was something that Obama was pushing, and I was writing about it. And of course, we've got Obama 2.0 now with Biden. And these are community schools. I mean, kids can now go to school, get breakfast, snacks. They can't, wait until lunchtime. Lunch, they want to bring in dinners, have medical clinics. And so the community school would take the place of the family. And that's, the way for the state to have complete control. That, they'll just, they want to, push the family aside and raise the kids themselves with these radical teachers. They're shaping their characters, and it's a scary thing. And it's, you know as it's tough for young couples. I think today, I mean, just the culture, what you see around you, to
Hmm.
sort of protect your children from all that. Um, and, but then in the 60s and 70s, you start to see that change in our society, where the family is not primary anymore.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting that you said that the community schools are taking the idea of them because they aren't very popular, at least not coast to coast. That's not to say that they won't ever be. They probably will be at some point, just judging by the way things are going right now. But I do
Mhm.
remember the whole, community school trend that not only Obama, but a lot of people and local governments and so on were advocating for. And it didn't occur to me that these were schools that were aimed at replacing the family, as you just so eloquently put it. However, it did occur to me at the time that these were meant to take the place of the church. And the reason
Mhm.
why that's where my mind went is because at the time I was on this huge kind of origins of the concept of separation versus state, or separation of church and state bit. So that's kind of where my mind was at the time. And the church is, for all intents and purposes, a community. When you read, for example, the book of Acts, you see these people having the, everything is centered around the fact that these are individuals who have given their lives to Christ, and that's what was bringing these people together. Um, and they were doing so by their own volition, not by the coercion of some kind of government agency or what have you. They were voluntarily moving by their own volition and being a part of the church where they were doing community. And of course, we
Mhm.
live in a very fast-paced world here in the 21st century, much faster paced than first century. Um, but uh, so because of the fast-pacedness of our society, we just don't do community in the same way in any kind of organization as they did in the early
Mhm.
church. Everybody's so spread apart, whereas once upon a time, people lived a lot closer together, and so it was very easy to spend a lot of time together and so on. Um, anyway, I'm kind of being long-winded, but when it comes to the community schools, it seemed to me that here you have an ilk of people who have argued all throughout the 20th century that there should be a separation of church and state. And everything that kind of smacked of religion within the schools, within the institutions, they were sounding the alarm of how this is co-signing a specific religion, namely Christianity. We all know what they were up to. They were trying to get rid of the Judeo-Christian ethic as the kind of undergird of society. They were, in a sense, trying to change what's the word, hegemony. They're trying to change the hegemony of society from being a Christian ethic to being more of a secular ethic. Um,
Mhm.
and so you saw this happening all throughout the 20th century: separation of church and state, separation of church and state, separation of church and state. But no one stopped to ask, well, is secularism a kind of religion as well? And I know it gets kind of convoluted, but when you look at the Humanist Manifesto, the first Humanist Manifesto, one of the signers of it, by the way, was John Dewey, uh,
Mhm.
among other kind of nefarious characters. It was called a religion. Secular humanism was called a religion. Now, it's interesting that John Dewey would sign such a thing, seeing as in how he is the father of modern education, public education. And so it seems to me, and you can tell me if you think I'm off base or if I'm not really connecting the dots all that great, but it seems to me that not only the whole concept of the community school, but where the public schools are trending, it seems to me that what they were able to do was completely eradicate the notion of a Judeo-Christian ethic and replace it with a kind of religious secularism that presents these kind of values that holds everybody accountable to those values, and to the extent that you break the law, you will be canceled. Which brings us back to the question I asked, 2 or 3 questions ago. So there's a question in there somewhere. I know I said a lot, but um, but yeah, what's your whole concept, or what's your thoughts on this notion that the community schools or the public schools or both kind of plays a role of a de facto church as well?
No, I think that's a great point that you bring up. Yeah, I mean, it's the church was the center of the community, and here you have the schools offering a replacement for it. And evenings, even weekends. I went to this one. I've been to some conferences, these teachers' conferences. I would go sort of undercover, and I remember at one, they were talking about how teachers should be going to make home visits,
Oh wow.
and talk to the parents, which is very scary.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, the teachers that they have these days are a strange breed. They want to control children. They're they're not like teachers of the old days, who generally were women, and they worked. When they weren't raising their children, it was a career.
Hmm.
There weren't too many career options, and they went in. They had a job to do. You taught reading, writing, and arithmetic, and history and science, and you had a curriculum. You had to get that across to students. You had to make sure that they learned that, and that was your job. That was it. But now these teachers are kind of like secular missionaries. You know,
Right.
they've got the pink hair and the piercings, and and they want to shape these little kids into um, their own image. It's really frightening. I mean, it kind of tells you that there's something wrong with these adults that are now educators. Um, I always used to, I've always said, when you have a job, whether it's teaching college or, um, teaching K through 12, or you're working in a submarine shop like I was, all these odd jobs you have when you're a teenager, you have a job description, right? You're going to get fired if start doing something else on your own.
Hmm.
And I think that's where we've gotten with education, because as you mentioned, like Dewey, these people have these grandiose ideas. And so Dewey changed the concept of education from something, where knowledge is imparted, right? Teachers have a limited function. They're going to impart knowledge. They're going to, and then also have prayer, as they used to do. You're going to socialize these kids
Mm.
and shape them into human beings who are, going to get along together in this new kind of society you're concocting up. So, so that has changed, and Dewey explicitly said that he wanted to do that. Didn't he? I
Mm-hmm.
mean, it was right. It's no longer, here, is what you need to learn, and you learn it. It's more like, we're going to mold these individuals into, cogs in this socialistic kind of society.
Yeah, that's very well said. Um, I wanted to ask you one more question before we landed the plane here. Uh, and the only reason I'm asking this question is because I've been doing a lot of thinking of it myself. I'm not going to comment on it. I just want your take on it. Or yeah. So, what do you believe are the pros and the cons of the Enlightenment?
Wow, that's a big one. Well, I think, the Enlightenment. It's been a while since I've thought of this. Um, the Enlightenment. Well, I could really get into this. My dissertation was on Walker Percy, who
Hmm.
was a
Yeah.
Catholic novelist. Right? Are you familiar with him?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So he thought that there was a split around the 14th century, and that faith and reason were artificially divided, and so that uh, you know made our society go down the wrong path, and we get into scientism, where people become so focused on reason and rationality that they believe that they have these sort of superpowers, and that they can see objectively, sort of with the mind or the eye of God, and they see themselves as godlike. And that's a dangerous path to go on, as we've seen in the 20th century with the totalitarian regimes. I mean, these are basically godless regimes. Whether it was Nazism or communism or whatever, you have these egotistical, maniacal dictators who believe that, they can be the rulers of the world, and there's no higher power that they need to answer to. And so, that I think is, if you wanted to say something bad about the Enlightenment, that people who kind of went off the deep end with the ideas of the power of human reason, I think you could say that would be a bad outcome of the Enlightenment. But then again, our form of government is said to have been, nurtured by the Enlightenment. So you had the founders who were men of the Enlightenment, also men of God. And I think you need to have both. But it's a very philosophical issue, and I could kind of go off on that and start revisiting, what I was writing in graduate school, and go back to my dissertation.
Yeah.
um, that was not something I was expecting.
Yeah. No, I think you and I share a lot of um, beliefs and ideas about that. So um, there's nothing that you just said that I disagree with your answer. So anyway, we have to do this again. I enjoyed my time with you. There's so much more I wanted to ask you, but we're kind of pressed for time right now. So hopefully you'll consider coming back.
Oh, I'd
So
love anytime.
so you're working on the Schuyler book right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
When can we see that
Yes.
on the bookshelves?
What's that?
When can we see that on the bookshelves?
Well, I'm looking for a publisher.
Okay.
It's hard to find a publisher for it. I have an agent. He's tried two or three times, and uh, the the tricky thing is that it's really scholarly and it's long because he's a complicated figure. You
Mm-hmm.
can't put him into a category. We talked about this a little bit, and and I think that so the problem is that with a scholarly book, and but I do want it to be accessible to average readers. You don't need a graduate degree in English to
Mm-hmm.
to read it. Besides, anything that's written by someone with a graduate degree in English is probably going to be something you don't want to read these days.
It's so true.
After having had to read so much of that stuff and suffering through it. But nonetheless, I am documenting everything, and he's very complicated. It's a complicated thing to explain because it goes against our traditional notions of history.
Mm-hmm.
We like to put things into simple categories. People, we were talking about conservatives and Martin Luther King. You have sound bites,
Mm-hmm.
and that's why Rand Paul got into trouble because you can't have a forum where you're explaining, well,
Yeah.
I'm for civil rights,
Yeah.
but then you have the
How
bureaucracy, and
dare
then
you
you
be
have the
intellectually honest?
yeah, and go into all those explanations.
Yeah.
And the problem with university presses is if you have peer reviewers, and these are other academics. Often they're people who specialize in African American or history or Black studies, and they're not hospitable to even mentioning Schuyler. And then the other publishers are a little reluctant because of his criticism of Martin Luther King and his membership in the John Birch Society,
Mm-hmm.
which, by the way, welcomed him with open arms. They were not a racist
Yeah,
organization,
I was about to say, you
whatever
mean
you.
the group that was supposed to be so racist?
What's that?
I say, you mean the group that was supposed to be so racist that we all learned in
Yeah,
elementary school was
yeah, yeah,
a big
yeah.
racist
So there are
organization?
all there are all these stereotypes, but
Yeah.
I'm hoping that I can stir up some interest in him because I think when we learn about him, we'll learn about another side of American history. He was very courageous. He went against the tide. Roy Wilkins, who was his friend,
Mm-hmm.
capitulated to the pressure of the 1950s and the 1960s. Schuyler did not. He was an independent thinker. He wasn't going to be bullied by anyone. He was someone who often had to have a loaded pistol next to his typewriter because
Mm-hmm.
of the threats from the communists. So,
Was Schuyler a member of the NAACP?
yes, he actually
Okay.
worked for the NAACP. He was a publicist for them, and then he worked as a business manager for the crisis. But he fell out with them in the 1950s because of their support of direct action,
Mm-hmm.
with King. And then, of course, once he criticized King, that was it. They went after him, and uh, you know, smeared him. The NAACP, it changed. It succumbed to the social pressures. I mean, not to say that there weren't socialists there at the beginning, but they did a lot of good work. They won a lot of legal cases, and that was the way Schuyler felt. That was the strategy he favored, was working through the courts, methodically as well as economically.
Mm-hmm.
He took up the cause of Booker T. Washington. He rediscovered him in the 1950s and just promoted him week after week, and encouraged his readers to follow the example of Booker T. Washington. He felt that power came economically, and as I said before, he didn't want to be as he was a very colorful writer, and he said he didn't want to be shaking the tin cup and begging or making empty threats, waving around empty pistols. He wanted people, he wanted the Black community to be self-supporting. I mean, one of the things he said, and he said it in a funny way, was that instead of marching, Black people needed, and wearing out shoes, they needed to be producing shoes. He said, why aren't we making shoes? Why aren't we making all these things? Why are we just, marching and protesting and, asking for things? We should be, doing what Booker T. Washington said. So,
Yeah,
a big
that's so
proponent
interesting to
of
me. The
that.
reason why it's interesting is because what I've noticed about writers, particularly people who spend a lot of time in their head, and they kind of deal more with the abstract than they do with the tangible stuff of the world. And this is the reason why most of the uh, most down to earth and realistic people that I know are individuals who work in the trades, whereas
Mm,
those who
right.
are writers tend to be, with the exception of you, but tend to be a little bit more kind of idealistic about things
Mhm.
and so on. Um, and so it's just interesting that to hear what you're saying about Schuyler kind of come full circle to the point where he's now promoting, probably the champion of, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get to work and produce and be a person of integrity and honor. To get to a place where he's now promoting someone like a Booker T. Washington is interesting to see a person who has their career devoted to writing,
Mhm.
celebrating someone like a Booker T. Washington. So I find that very fascinating.
Yes. What's that?
I said I find that very fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. Schuyler was very much a realist, and one of the fascinating things, one of the most amusing things that I found in my research was his conflict with W.E.B. Du Bois. They were enemies, and I've discovered some things where Du Bois really um, was manipulating people around him, sabotaging what Schuyler was doing. Schuyler dropped out of high school at the age of 17, went into the Army. He had practical experience. He knew who the con artists were. He knew the criminal element. He was streetwise. I mean, he was in the real world, and like you said, in the trades, and he'd worked in the trades. I mean, he worked in construction. He was at one point homeless. Was living in the Bowery, so he wasn't like W.E.B. Du Bois, who eventually, moved to Ghana and, gave up his citizenship and joined the Communist Party. But Du Bois, we have the stark contrast. Here he was elevated and, you know, pushed along and treated as if he were this genius, and his head was always in the clouds. I mean, he just did so many harmful things because of his ego and
Yeah.
his idealism. um, and Schuyler, he's like, wait a minute, what are you saying here? You're just going to lead, you think you're the talented 10th, but you're going to be leading the people that you're leading into the gutter, into their deaths. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, we need people who are practical,
Mm-hmm.
and they're the conservatives. They're the ones who, and that's, I think, a disadvantage because, you know, the left has taken over academia, and so we've been pushed out, and conservatives are rooted in the real world. As you say, you have to go out. You can't be an idealist when you're trying to build a bridge,
Mm-hmm.
or save a patient's life, or
Right. You got to
fix
be
a
practical.
plumbing problem, right?
Yeah. No, it's funny because whenever you look at this kind of tiff between Du Bois and Washington on a basic scale, uh, Du Bois was advocating for activism and getting into these prestigious schools and claiming your place and all these things, whereas Washington was advocating for, well, if you want the place and you want the status and the position, you have to earn it, and you have to earn it by starting from the bottom and working your way up. And so it's a very practical approach versus an idealistic approach. And the problem with that idealistic approach is that it uh, it's going to have counterproductive results along the way, because to the extent that you agitate people and to the extent that you try to force something into action by law, it's going to cause a kind of recoil effect from others and from what I'm saying. So it's like, and we see that too with the Civil Rights Act. Um, from my own research, what I saw demonstrated in society was this kind of gradual coming together of the races, whether it be at the workbench or all across the society. There was evidence of this, and Denzel Washington, the famed actor, famously said, you can't legislate love. You can't legislate people into loving each other. And to the extent that you try, it's going to have uh, an adverse effect. It's going to have
Mm-hmm.
a worse effect on society than the way conditions were before this
Mm.
legislation was pushed to begin with. And so, yeah. Um, but anyway,
Yeah.
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say that's exactly what Schuyler was saying.
Mm-hmm.
He was saying, um, he didn't like that strategy because he understood human nature, and that's what Du Bois didn't understand. Schuyler understood human psychology, and you push people and you force them to do something, the more you're going to alienate them.
Mm-hmm.
And he was someone who thought that the NAACP should take a less adversarial approach. I mean, when he was, you know, helping with their publicity, he put forward this plan. He said, we should go into the communities. We should, have activities with white people. We should do things together, not just go in and, say we demand this, or we're going to sue you for that.
Mm-hmm.
So you know, he was really someone who, was colorblind. He felt that race was a superstition, that dividing people by races was just a ridiculous thing to do. But yet at the same time, he recognized that people had prejudices, and he recognized that when you, like you said, when you force something on people, they resist it. And so he was trying to, promote another way. I mean, he went to the South many times, took several trips, and in 1948 he wrote a series of articles called "What's Good About the South," and these were positive stories about black business owners, people who owned stores, general stores, lots of land, communities, the interactions between whites and blacks in these communities when it wasn't forced on them. He even went into back in 1925, 26. Here he is, he's been raised in New York State. He goes down to the South for the first time, and he's going to be the house guest of this black doctor. This black doctor lives in a white neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
Then, when you had the federal government coming into the housing business, those neighborhoods became segregated. Not to say that there wasn't discrimination and segregation, but there were some communities. And he was shocked. But it was more like, well, we know you, and you are a well-to-do doctor. You're welcome in this neighborhood. I mean, that wasn't the case everywhere, but it was in some communities. So he understood that and exactly what you were saying.
Yeah.
And yeah.
I feel like Schuyler and I would have gotten along very well.
Oh yeah, he would have just like you are sort of rediscovering what Schuyler was saying, and it sounds like you know about him already, and so yeah, so hopefully more people will learn about him and the good work that you're doing. So
Yeah. I look forward to reading more of your work, especially the Schuyler book. Hopefully, I can lean on you for some consultation as we get into the making of Uncle Tom 3, specifically as it relates to some of Schuyler's research. Again, I hope to have you back on the show, and thank you so much for joining me this evening.
oh, thank you, it was a pleasure.
All right. Thank you all for watching, and you all have a good night.